Today, we're going deeper into witchcraft, and we're going to describe some of Favresada's initial successes in documenting witchcraft. But we should always be aware that the subsequent chapters are going to have her being bewitched herself. So in many ways, this is very much the beginning of a much wilder tale. So here we go. We start this chapter on page 30 with this interesting sort of epigraph. Of course, you aren't taught about that, namely spells at school. No fear of you being taught that. It's never mentioned to you in a book. There's no fear of anyone talking about it. Yet, for all your sciences, you believe it. This is the unwatcher speaking to a young schoolgirl. He's arguing that despite everybody saying this doesn't exist and it not being in the books and whatnot, it's still very real and it's very much circulating in their world. So Favrestada starts out by saying that somebody has to be credulous. Somebody has to believe these people. Somebody has to really look into it and not just dismiss it. She gives a specific time frame for her field research, which is from July of 1969 to September of 1971. And then 4 years afterwards, she would come back for a month or two once a year. Remember that she was forced by her bewitching and unwitching experiences to leave. She got really freaked out. Now, generally when witchcraft and the bocage is described, nobody takes it seriously. And if journalists or folklorists come, they just gather stories that sort of titillate, but also belittle. The description of witchery and witchcraft is exploitative. And I mean that in two senses of the terms. It's exploitative in the sense of something like exploitation cinema isn't for high art. It is only for impactful entertainment. And it's exploitative as in exploiting your workers because it does not take them seriously and it uses the villagers for entertainment in a kind of rude way, I would say. So the thing is, when the journalists are coming around, they're really on the side of two kind of big things. One is a school of thought called logical positivism. And the other is a characteristic Frenchness. So the French have a very solid notion of sort of being a modern person, of being in a modern era, of being rational, non-superstitious, materially oriented, forward-thinking. So where does this come from? Well, it comes from a period of time in the West called the Enlightenment. Now, what do I mean when I say Enlightenment? The Enlightenment is not what the Buddha was advocating. This Enlightenment is called the Age of Reason. From the 17th to the 18th century, Western, sort of European and Western European, in particular, Western European thinking took on this age of reason. Now, in this age of reason, in this Enlightenment, and this is why Favresada says, you know, these people are still French. So when you're talking to them, they'll be like, no, this is kind of hinky because we're French. So we're very reasonable. We're thinking people. So the journalists are on the side of this logical positivism and their French identity. So in logical positivism and this age of reason, the high goal of life is happiness that is achieved through the light of reason being applied to all concepts. It dispels the power of monarchies and the church, putting forth material reasoning as the main virtue and the main practice of the modern thinking individual. So they posit, materiality for all things that occur. Natural law, as in the nature of the body, shows you the nature of the way you should be. Natural law. So taking a understanding of the world as descriptive and then using that description to be prescriptive. We should aspire to be just as the world is. There was a disenchantment of the world. This is Weber talks about the disenchantment of the world. So there's no longer a God up and angels all over the place. But there is a new form of Christianity called deism. Deism posits that the world was created by God and then he had nothing to do with it afterwards. So deists would argue that God is like a great watchmaker. He makes that fantastic watch, the universe, and then he's gone and doesn't interfere with the world. This is the power of science, the power of I think therefore I am. This French ideal is depicted in such thinkers as Voltaire. It's sort of a high humanism that's anti-superstition. When I looked up positivism in the OED to get a little read on it, we read only observable phenomena and empirically verifiable scientific facts and laws, rejecting inquiry into the ultimate causes or origins as belonging to outmoded metaphysical or theological stages of thought. A humanist religion based on this system. Later, positivism ends up meaning just only an appeal to science and reason, rejecting anything non-physical. And this is really still the prevailing paradigm of our time in our public life. We are very much positivists in life, despite, or at least in the public we are, because when we get home, we do all sorts of weird stuff. So the journalists report about a number of eccentric unwitchers, is what Favre calls them. So these are the crazy ones that make the headlines. But the thing is, the eccentric unwitchers do not adhere to the local traditions. They're not local. And we see that everything in witchcraft is about your immediate locality. So when there's descriptions of these people doing sort of crazy things like putting an expensive dollar amount in a piece of pork left outside, and then if the dollar's gone, the witchcraft is gone. Or sleeping in the beds of bewitched couples. Some argue that the dollars are gone because their helper, while the person is distracting the bewitched couple in bed, goes and takes the money. Or having a naked wife ride her cattle backward into the barn. They are said to do unwitching for money and to go to bed, i.e. get sex. So they're not local and they're fantastic, so they're really not relevant. And the unwitchers locally would never connect themselves to be of the same kind as these eccentric unwitchers. Now, I've said before that there's no real set system for witchcraft and unwitching. But these eccentric unwitchers do not follow the patterns observed in Bocage. They're completely making stuff up. So these are sort of the counter cases to the sober local unwitchers. When they describe these people, it's not to say that unwitching is bad. It's to say that these people are bad and ridiculous, and our unwitchers are not like this. Now, like I said, all witchcraft is local. The witch has to be able to physically touch you. Any non-local figure or practice couldn't be relevant because they're too far off to touch. Now, the thing is, our villagers are not fools. Their lord does something, and it has structures. It cannot just be useless fantasy or valueless fantasy. Favre really reveals these circulating structures of witchcraft. But I start to wonder, are there any positive aspects to this witchcraft theodicy, this witchcraft as a reason to explain suffering in the world? Well, maybe. I mean, there's psychodrama, which is, acting out acting out what's going on in your soul. Informal therapy with the unwitchers. We'll see that the unwitchers do this therapeutic thing where you tell them all of their secrets and everything going on in your life. So there's an informal level of therapy. There are patterns of meaning and suffering. So there's a reason why you suffer. And it's not like the church tells you that you suffer because you're human and you suffer because you're good and God makes people suffer who are good people. However, the rhetoric is murderous and violent. There's also an attitude of fear that pervades everything. And where there was once, say, a material world where things happened for material reasons, now suddenly the world is enchanted and it's occupied by all sorts of dangerous creatures and forces. So one other little thing I like to think about is that this newly enchanted world harms the individual. You'll see that the person who believes they're suffering from witchcraft is very much harmed by these ideas, which we don't see as much in the Azandi. So another odd thing is after the unwitchers do their work, they tend to stick around and have sort of an informal exchange relationship for various reasons with their clients for the remainder of their days. Now, back to the journalism school, I thought it was interesting that Favre says that she learned something from working with journalists, and she was regularly interviewed on TV and wrote articles and whatnot. She says, "As for myself, I have learned from experience that whatever I do wish to convey, the newspapers will always distort my sentences on the topic or my statements on the topic in such a way that they end up sounding like an improved version of the official discourse on spells. So officially, people are like, spells are weird and blah, blah, blah. And then when she's talking about spells and whatnot, they make her sound like she's being dismissive as well. Unless, she says, unless they just write her off completely as a fool. All right, take a break, y'all. I'll be right back.